Today we will be discussing one of the most prominent literary terms, perhaps we should say literary philosophy, a philosophy of composition for that matter. We will be discussing realism. Now, it is not difficult to understand what realism means or what a realist would be like. But the very simplicity of this idea makes it a little difficult to explain it. Like how every simple thing in this universe is a little difficult to explain, realism is also difficult, complex when you start explaining it. Because for one, you would see that realism developed differently in different places. It is possible for us to trace a tradition of French realism, like how it is possible for us to trace a tradition of British realism, Russian realism or German realism when you talk about European fictions. The very nature of a place's political history determines how realism is coordinated, how realism is shaped in that literary tradition. So because of the time constraint, let us not go into detailed analysis of the various European literary realisms. Instead, let us focus on two most important perhaps, branches of literary realism that emerged in 18th century and 19th century in Europe. One is French realism and the other is British realism. These two schools of realism, these two practices of realism, let us try to look at the details of these two practices, these two branches, these two histories of realistic literary composition. It is commonly agreed that realism started in France with the work of such titans of literature like Stendhal, Balzac and Flaubert. But if you want to really trace the history of realism, if you really want to trace the roots, the origin of realism, we should perhaps look back into the history of France. We should go back to the history of France in 17th century and maybe look at this particular institution which was brought into effect in 1634, namely Academia Française. Academia Française was an institute entitled with the responsibility of checking into what the writers were doing in their works, what kind of literature was being produced, what kind of politics is being advocated. Academia Française was supposed to delimit, censor rebellious tendencies in literary art. A major 17th century figure who went against the norms set by Academia Française was Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo, very famously in his Hunchback of Notre Dame for that matter, or his play Cromwell for that matter, he resisted the ways in which Academia Française was trying to, close down the scope of literary writing. His preface to the play Cromwell is now identified as the manifesto of a French romantic writing. You should also remember how from 1789 onwards, France is one of the most politicized cultures that existed in Europe. With the storming of Bastille, with the advent of French Revolution, with the ascent of Napoleon Bonaparte, with the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte in Waterloo, with the restoration of Bourbon monarchy, with the coming of Louis Philippe, with the coming of Napoleon III, you find that there is this long history of political upheavals in France, alongside which you have the development of French realism as well. French realism associated itself closely with all those radical political changes that were happening in French society. So you would find, like the very first titan of realist literature, Stendhal for that matter, you would find that Stendhal, who's from the background of journalism, most of these realist writers have something to do with journalism, writing facts, writing reports, writing news, writing details. This kind of a practice would basically enable them to try something different from the romantic way of writing novels. They would identify themselves with scientificity, how objectivity is needed in your writing, how empirical correctness is a virtue, how factual reporting of your contemporary context is a virtue. I mean, they upheld all those things, all those scientific, objective, descriptive, factual context as a virtue around which novels must be constructed. Now look at a classic example of early realist fiction, early French realist fiction, like Stendhal's Red and Black. So you would find that the hero Sorel, for that matter, is essentially a documenter. Wherever he goes, he very curiously, very painstakingly describes what he sees around him. In very sparse prose, for that matter, in very sparse prose, in very hard-hitting prose, you have Stendhal describing the context in which his hero moves around. His hero's fortune is moved around. Stendhal is perhaps the beginning of this writing, and Stendhal, however, was not a major success. Stendhal's ways of revolutionary novel writing was not recognized until his successor, much younger successor, Balzac, gave him a very warm and favorable review by the end of his life. In fact, after he died, he became famous. Stendhal became famous. Stendhal became important for French literary tradition after he died. Posthumously, when Balzac publishes a review of Stendhal's last novel, Charterhouse of Parama, that is when Stendhal actually started becoming a sort of a pioneer. Stendhal Stendhal was identified as a pioneer in realist fiction after Balzac gave him a warm and favorable review, after his death. And Balzac perhaps is therefore very central when we discuss the history of realist fiction. Balzac's way of looking at the world, Balzac's way of identifying the French context, the French society during the Revolution and after the Revolution, his painstakingly minuscule way of understanding psychological impulses as well as social conflicts, all these would contribute a lot when it comes to the technique of realistic writing. All this would basically contribute a lot. Also, you can think of how by the end of his career he would say, I was not writing disparate tales, I was not writing discrete units of fictional fictional attempts. He said, I was writing I was into this grand project called human comedy. He says all the 14 novels that he had written till then is basically part of something called the human comedy, and in human comedy he was trying to give you a realistic portrayal of how his society was at that particular point of historical development. So using the entire corpus of his literary enterprise to constitute one grand body of realistic work, well, that is what Balzac did. His entire body of works could be put together. You can read that together, you can put that together, you can think of that as one enterprise, one grand realistic enterprise. And that is where Balzac becomes, and that is how Balzac becomes important to the French realistic literary tradition, and perhaps the entire international realistic tradition would look at Balzac as a very central figure. How he turns the keys. He is the one who turns the key. He is the one who identifies Stendhal as a pioneer. He is the one who takes this kind of writing forward, and he is the one who inspires the next important realist writer, Gustave Flaubert, to arrive at a certain ground wherein he is able to create theories regarding realist fiction. Flaubert is perhaps the first person who gave concrete theories about how a realist novel should be, how a realist novelist's perspective should be, how these things must be coordinated. So you would find him giving his ideas, like for instance he says a novelist must be like a god. He says, it is one of my principles that you must not write yourself, the artist ought to be like God in creation, invisible and omnipotent. He should be felt everywhere, but not seen. Now this is Flaubert talking about the realist novelist. So the realist novelist must be, in Flaubert's perspective, some kind of a god, a creative force, that should basically make himself invisible. He should be an omniscient narrator. He should erase himself completely from the work. He should be like a god. He should be somebody who hides behind his work. And Flaubert actually thought that his masterpiece, I mean, Madame Bovary, was a work where he achieved this total invisibility of the author. He wanted the author to be nowhere present in the work. Like when you think about a realist writer, Flaubert's idea of a realist writer, he's trying to tell us that the very nature of a realist work is that it disposes the authorial voice. Let's not forget that there is this omniscient narrator who is giving us the story, but this omniscient narrator is minimized. The intervention of the omniscient narrator is minimized. Let us look at how Flaubert does this in Madame Bovary. Madame Bovary, as you know, is a work that focuses on the miserable and everyday tragedy of a lower middle class woman, a country woman, whose ambitions are fed by romances. Her diet of romantic novels, her diet of romantic literature, essentially tells her that an ideal kind of love is possible, an ideal kind of life is possible, and this love can be obtained when you transform yourself into the aristocracy, when you upgrade yourself into aristocracy, when you have connections with aristocracy, when you are with the elite. It is possible for you to enjoy a kind of love, a kind of satisfaction, a kind of revelatory bliss. And then she pursues this ambition, she pursues this idea of divine romantic love all through the book, and we find that she ends in a very dismal death. She meets with a very sad death by the end of the novel. And how Flaubert draws the fortune of Madame Bovary makes a very interesting case study in the method of realism. Like even though he is an omniscient narrator, most of the time what he does is he erases himself from commenting upon the activities and thoughts of Emma Bovary, and instead gives us a chance to go into the perspective of the character and look at the events, look at the context, look at the incidents that are happening around through the perspective of the character Emma Bovary. Now, I've just tried to illustrate that point from a small passage that we take from Madame Bovary, for that matter. Look at this particular passage in the text where Emma Bovary is passing a very tedious Sunday in winter, and she has these two characters with her. She has her husband Charles and her lover to be Leon. Both are with her, and then she is commenting on them, and this is how the novel depicts that scene. She turned round. There stood Charles, his cap pulled down over his eyes, his thick lips trembling, which lent an added stupidity to his face. Even his back, that stolid back of his, was irritating to see. His frock coat seemed to wear upon it the whole drabness of the personality within. As she surveyed him, tasting a kind of vicious ecstasy in her irritation, Leon moved a step forward. White with cold, his face seemed to assume a softer languor. Between his neck and the cravat, the collar of his shirt was loose and showed some skin. The tip of his ear stuck out beneath a lock of hair, and his big blue eyes, raised to the clouds, looked to Emma more limpid and more lovely than mountain tarns that mirror the sky. Now, if you look at the description, it is not the novelist who is describing these two characters. It is Emma Bovary's perspective that is comprehending her husband as well as the character of Leon. Now the thick lip of the husband or the coat of the husband, adding stupidity to the character. The earlobe that stands out of Leon's frock coat, adding divinity to the character. These are perspectives that are largely uncommented by the novelist himself. The commentary about these details, the commentary on these details are actually supplied to us by Emma Bovary herself. But this is not a first person narrative. So in a third person narrative, in an omniscient narrative frame, what we have is the inner psychological reality of that character. And this is what Flaubert means by becoming a god, becoming an invisible presence, taking the authorial voice completely out of the text, keeping the character as the central force of detailing events of a novel. So plot takes a backseat, and you have character being projected as the most important factor of writing a novel. Now this goes against the norms of romantic writing. This goes against the norms of 17th century and 18th century fiction writing, where it was important to have a plot. It was important to have an elitist viewpoint, an idealist viewpoint, an idealist morality to be, an idealist morality, an idealist moral framework needs to be, integrated into the body of the text in the 18th century and 17th century writings. But from 19th century onwards, and remember 1857 is when Madame Bovary was released. So 2 years later, 1859, you have Darwin coming up with On the Origin of Species. So you have this scientific way of looking at things, the objective way of looking at things, and disposing the divine, disposing the universal truth, disposing the perspective of the God from narration, from narratives, and bringing more of everyday, bringing more of factual, scientific, objective, descriptive details of the everyday life. Crowding the books, crowding the novels with such details is one of the reasons why most of these realist novels are so thick. Now when you think about romantic fiction, you wouldn't have such a grand triple-decker sized novels. Romantic narratives are generally poetic in their rhythm, the way in which they talk about chivalry, the way in which they talk about idealism. It makes their scope very limited. But the scope of a realist novel is so vast, because it doesn't stop with mere descriptions. It also goes into the the ambitious project of describing what is real, what is reality. And this philosophical question is so crucial to the understanding of 19th century realist novel. This would be expanded, this would be enhanced when you have the next major stop coming with the writer Émile Zola, because Zola in his naturalism, that is what he called. He did not want to be identified as a realist per se. He called himself a naturalist. So the naturalist will take this tendency a little further. He'll take it a little forward. He would say that beyond realism, you need to move beyond realism. You need to not just depict everyday drab realities. You should have a focus on what is dirty. You should have a focus on what is labeled as obscene. You should have your emphasis on what is being labeled as unfit for literature. So in that manner, you have Zola revolutionizing realist literature further in the next few decades after Flaubert. So if you consider the history of French realism, the three most important figures that we should concentrate on is Stendhal, Balzac and Flaubert. Now, with Flaubert, perhaps we should say realism reaches its maximum achievement. French realism becomes its, becomes its most productive, arrives at its most productive stage with Flaubert's Madame Bovary. Beyond that, you have Émile Zola taking it up, and Émile Zola reforming it into the newer school called naturalism, which we will take up later. So this history of French realism should basically enable us to see that realism as we understand, realist technique as we understand, should be read along with how general philosophy, general history and general political discourse of a region. It should be, realism is so integrally connected to these factors. You should look into the philosophy that works behind it. You should look at the institutions it is reacting against. I mean, one major issue with a realist novel is that when you think of a realist novel, there is a way of critical dismissal of realist novel. Because realist novel is usually identified as bourgeois in its value system, realist novel is usually looked upon as non-experimental. Realist novel is sometimes discredited for its siding with the middle class. One thing that we should not forget is that most of those realist novels that we are talking about, Charterhouse of Parama for that matter, or The Human Comedy for that matter, or Madame Bovary for that matter, they held the bourgeois society in a critical light. They did not endorse it. I mean, look at Emma Bovary's plight. Flaubert is not trying to celebrate Emma Bovary. Flaubert is trying to show how she is stupid. Flaubert is trying to describe how her life and her philosophy is insipid, how she is not able to take forward her ideas regarding romantic ideals, how bourgeois society is so false. So this is also a revolution that we are talking about. We are not talking about a conformist way of writing text. We are talking about a revolutionary way of writing literature, writing novels. So there is the very school of realism must not be taken as a conformist school, even though later, when experimental writing, when modernist writing started critiquing realist ways of narration for its siding with bourgeois life, there is a problem. When you look at the beginnings of realist writing, it is as revolutionary, as iconoclastic as modernism would later be hailed. If you look at the major tendencies, major features of realism for that matter, realism as it emerged in France for that matter, there are this emphasis on particular at the expense of the universal for that matter. You have universal truths to talk about, but none of these writers that we have discussed, neither Stendhal nor Balzac nor Flaubert, they were not interested in universal truth. Universal truths for that matter. They were more interested, they were more focused on depicting truths as perceived by individuals. Focus was on individuals. Now, using individual as a focus is new. At that point of time, at that point of history, writing about an individual, focusing on the individual's perspective was a very novel way of narrating a story. Taking the author completely out of the picture was a very new way of looking at novel narration. So in that sense, French realism must be taken as one of the revolutionary breaks that occurred in the history of novel. In the history of, when we say history of novel, we should also look at novel as the most dominant realist genre. Poetry, drama. There are several ways of writing literature, and before 19th century bloomed, all those other branches of writing, poetry, plays for that matter, they were held in high esteem. But with the arrival of the new reading class, the middle class, and with the rise of literacy among women and the lower middle class and the working class, you would find that poetry and drama gradually take a backseat, and you have novels coming to the fore. And therefore realism must also be discussed as a major stooge against which the history of novels can be constructed. A history of novel could be written alongside the history of realism, beginning with Victor Hugo in France, beginning with Daniel Defoe in Britain. You can write about realism side by side with the history of historiography of novels. That is why in one of the classics of British critical writing, The Rise of the Novel, written by Ian Watt in 1987, you would find that the rise of the novel is also tracing the rise of realism in France, in Britain. So most of those critics that wrote about novels, Lucas for that matter, Ian Watt for that matter, Harry Levin for that matter, most of them stressed how realism started really taking off after novels became popular in Europe. Reading novels, the way public focused on reading novels, is responsible for the penchant for realism as well. Realism, in that sense, integrally is connected with the genre of novel. Realism and a novel can be written in many ways. Like, you have romantic novelists like Walter Scott, for that matter. But Walter Scott's kind of writing will not be identified as a novel proper if you read it today, because now the very sense of novel that we have today is somehow aligned with our sense of realistic writing. The 19th century developments in novel have become so crucial to the understanding of the genre of novel that we need to focus on realism if you have to understand the craft of what we now understand as novelistic writing. Now, I have emphasized on how the genre of novel is connected, associated, aligned with the development of realism, but it is interesting to note that the first realist wasn't a novelist. I mean, the term realism as a label was not first used to describe a novelist, it was actually used to describe a painter. One of the close friends of Gustave Flaubert, Gustave Courbet, Courbet was the first branded realist, and he was a painter. The ways in which his rebellion actually took off in the beginning of mid-century France, well, that is where realism was actually identified as a school. The Courbet would shift the focus of painting from elitist scenes to everyday scenes in peasant life, labor classes life, lower middle classes life. So he would depict, these everyday scenes in so realistic a manner that painting was actually revolutionized. And in 1855, you have Courbet coming up with his own exhibition of realistic paintings, because he was rejected by the National Academy, and his works were discredited in the National Academy. He actually sets up his own pavilion outside that exhibition, and he calls that an exhibition of realism. So that is when this particular term was actually born. This critical term, this label was actually born with Courbet's exhibition, Courbet's individual solo exhibition. And Courbet was a close friend of Gustave Flaubert, and in another 2 years you will have the classic of realist writing, Madame Bovary, published. So perhaps you should also see that when we discuss French realism, the name of Courbet is very important. Along with Flaubert, along with Stendhal, along with Balzac, who are all novelists, this particular painter and this monumental painting that he made, the origin of the world, something that shocked the sensibilities of French aristocracy, because he portrayed the genitalia of a model in great close-up, and then he had the audacity to put it on exhibition, and that shock, which sent waves up the bourgeois sensibility, is actually behind the impetus of realistic writing in France. Why I said this is we shouldn't feel that, or we shouldn't discredit realism as something that is complacent, something that is middle class, something that is conventional, something that is non-shocking. On the contrary, realism actually started with shock waves sent up the bourgeois sensibility in France in mid-century. So with that, we would wind up the discussion of French realism. Thank you.